Deprogram with Michael Parker on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, folks, it is hour 2 here on Deprogram TNT. And very happy to have Matt Ehret back on the show. He's going to be joining us in just a second. We're going to talk about a lot of different things. We're going to freeform it, have fun on a Friday. Before we get to that, I have to talk a little bit about this affidavit. Now, everybody's talking about it. I don't want anybody to get too excited because they're going to redact this thing to the point that it's not going to tell you very much. But what's more interesting to me is just the kind of the atmosphere around the fact that it's possibly going to be released. And the person that's asking for it to be released or ruling from the bench is this Judge Bruce Reinhart guy. Now, he's the guy, he's one of the 3 magistrates down there and famously kind of red meat for the people on the right in that he was formerly defended some of the Epstein employees. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's a bad guy, but it does send up a couple of flags. You kind of wonder. But I get the feeling, I said a week or 2 ago that, you know, when this thing doesn't pan out, which I don't think it will, the people that they're going to throw under the bus, this is going to be one of the guys. I think they're going to throw him under the bus. I think he already senses that. And I don't know if he knew when he was signing it what exactly it was or what they're going to do with it. So I just have a feeling, a hunch that he's like, he may try to get out in front of this because he's basically saying, let's go ahead and release it upon redaction. Now, when they redact it and they go through it with the black magic marker, what we all get to see eventually in a week or 2 or 3 or whatever it is after we've talked it to death, there probably won't be anything truly groundbreaking in it. They will probably, whoever was the person, the witness or the whistleblower, whatever we want to call it, that called this thing into being, his name, I'm sure, will not be in there, the informant. And what they're looking for, that probably won't be in there either. All I'm saying is, yes, I think the affidavit's going to come out. And in a perfect world, it wouldn't be redacted and we would know what this is all about. I think we know what it's all about anyway, but then we would know, but that's not going to happen. It's going to be redacted. They're going to talk about it. Maybe next week we will know. And it's funny because this guy, let me just read what he says. This is the Judge Reinhart guy, and we've talked about him quite a bit on here. Judge Reinhart went on to say he was leaning towards releasing portions of the document, adding that, quote, whether these portions would be meaningful to the public or the media was not for him to decide. He also acknowledged that the redaction process could often be extensive and sometimes turn documents into, get this, meaningless gibberish. Say it ain't so. Well, anyway, we will see. And this whole thing is, we've talked about it a lot, but we still want to know what it's about. And will it result in anything other than bullying more people around Trump? Well, Matt's going to give us his thoughts on this as well. This is TNT Radio, and we'll be back with Matt in just a second.
Engaged and informed conversation.
They say what I'm thinking.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, folks, I am very excited to have Matthew Ehret on the show, and he was rushing through traffic wherever he is, if it's in Canada or here in the States, I'm not sure, but he made it on time to the Zoom. He is a journalist, a lecturer, a founder of the Canadian Patriot Review. He's a director at the Rising Tide Foundation, a senior fellow at the American University in Moscow, and he has authored a 3-volume Untold History of Canada series. He has the 2-volume Clash of Two Americas. He hosts the weekly podcast Great Game on Rogue News. And he also has a documentary series, The Unfinished Symphony, that I have been watching a bit of. Matt, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me back on, Michael.
Well, I'm glad for you to be here. And now, forgive me, I was watching one of your videos today, and I'm embarrassed all of a sudden, and I don't have in my notes. You were speaking with one of your buddies that I've seen you on a couple of shows now. You guys were discussing Bannon. You were discussing controlled opposition, and it was very interesting. I want to credit the podcast. Which podcast was that again?
That was probably Rogue News with V, the Guerrilla Economist. Yeah.
I think you're right. And I did enjoy it. And when I was watching, I was like, man, I got to tell Matt this. So it's funny because Peter Duke was who introduced me to your work. And I think you know Peter. Anyway, yeah. He and I used to work together, and we're all kind of on similar teams here, and he and I have talked about this idea of controlled opposition. You talk about controlled opposition in that interview, and I've sometimes complained that I think the term controlled opposition gets tossed around a little bit too much, sometimes by people who don't fully understand what that is, and you do. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. And one of the people that came up in that conversation is Steve Bannon. And he's an interesting character. And I'm not going to ask you to re-say everything you said on that one, but Steve Bannon is somebody we got to keep an eye on. And just your thoughts on Bannon.
Yeah, there's a lot in that to unpack with that, which I guess I'll try to do justice as best I can. I find it, there's a lot of stuff that Steve Bannon says, obviously, in the war room that I have no problems with. The whole idea of taking back the country from the deep state, all of that's fine. I've got no problem with that. The criticisms on the Great Reset, the fraud of the what we've been told is a pandemic to end all pandemics, all of that stuff I'm fine with. But that's often how this stuff works. Poison will often only be eaten if it's covered in a lot of honey. I think that there was a reason why Trump expelled him from his inner circle after a few minutes back in 2017. And people say, oh, it's all about, Zionist, evil Jared Kushner, who was the one who really had the reins and got Bannon, the patriot, exiled. I don't think so. And I think when I look at the
interesting.
When I look at the program that Trump had put forth, the most potent aspects of Trump's 4-year campaign, not just to stay alive against this whole Russiagate hoax, but rather to also bring about an alternative economic and political security model that would challenge the structures of the existent financier oligarchy that I know exists, centered in the city of London, with its multifaceted, Five Eyes intelligence control, military industrial control, academic, intelligentsia control. So it's one beast with different aspects. Now, this thing was challenged primarily by things that Trump was doing that Bannon is opposed to. And I think that one of the most potent things involves Trump's discussion early on to restore Glass-Steagall, breaking up the Wall Street banks, not just shutting down the Federal Reserve, which was what Bannon recently said. And I'm for shutting down the Federal Reserve. That's fine. But breaking up the Wall Street banks, flushing all of this speculative derivative contracts out the window, restoring protectionism, but also vectoring the U.S. towards a cooperative policy with Russia and China on economic measures. And Trump made several speeches, especially the biggest one in June 2019 with the vice premier of China in the White House, basically saying Russia, China, the U.S. have to stop spending billions on nuclear weapons and instead put all of that money towards building real infrastructure for the world. That's the sort of thing a U.S., Russia, China plus India, alliance would be the sort of power brokerage that could break the back of the financier oligarchy, which is something that has been that's why they were afraid of what Trump was reawakening. Because had John F. Kennedy been alive, had any of the great patriots who got killed while in office been alive, that's the sort of thinking they would have invoked. Both break up the Wall Street banks, rein them in, and then go for large-scale infrastructure and global development in order to reduce the chance of war, but also create trust-building measures and real wealth generation around the world. So Trump did those things, and today most people who don't like the Great Reset are falling sway to the type of narratives that are pushed by Bannon and his clique, including people like Miles Gao, who is part of the actual deep state structures in China. They think that the enemy of the world is not the actual financier oligarchy centered in London, which goes back to the old Venetian black nobility, which is really, that's the continuous oligarchical system. It's the same British Empire. It's the same Venetian Empire. This is the worst of the Roman Empire. It's the same families. People aren't looking at any of those things. And instead they're thinking it's evil, big, bad China that's out to destroy the exceptional West or the exceptional USA. And they're just, it's oversimplistic and I think lobotomizing a lot of people. So I do think that Bannon, with the connections I go through that we could talk about regarding, his connection to the some of the upper echelon nobles of Europe, I think he's a controlled opposition.
Well, okay, so that makes sense. And part of the reason I wanted to bring this up was just to tell you, because you may find this interesting. My audience might find it interesting, because you talk a little bit about the biosphere. For people who don't know about the biosphere, it was this self-contained structure in Oracle, Arizona. And I actually worked for the people who dreamt that up. And they were a cult is maybe not the right word or the best word, but it's kind of what it was. And they were and there's a good movie about them. There is a documentary out. It's called Spaceship Earth, came out in 2020. Go watch it. And it shows you who these people are. And they came out of San Francisco. They were young people led by a guy named John P. Allen, who within the group was called Johnny Dolphin. But anyway, they had a theatrical group. They created an ocean-going vessel out of concrete, believe it or not. And basically, he was the visionary for these young people. And they claimed they weren't doing psychedelics at the time. They claimed they like to work and get stuff done. I don't know if that's necessarily true. They ended up moving to New Mexico. That is where Ed Bass, who was the youngest brother of a billionaire Texas oil family, the Basses, he runs into them. They take him in. He then becomes the financier for all of these projects, I was working for Caravan of Dreams, which is a multi-level performance art place in Fort Worth, Texas, which is where he lived. And it was genius. It was, they had a record label. They had a jazz club. They had a theater. They were also heavily into Buckminster Fuller. So we had a geodesic dome on the top of the building, and it had all these rocks in it. And basically what it was, because they had this club, they were building the biosphere when I was working for them. They also had art galleries in Europe. They had grasslands in Australia, and their ultimate goal was to terraform Mars. And I think they were using psychedelics, and they were living in the building. And so I worked for them. I just worked because they were very much into avant-garde jazz. So we put out Ornette Coleman records. For me, as a young guy exploring music, it blew my mind and turned me on to a lot of stuff. I was playing indie rock, and they accepted me, but I also knew to keep my distance from them, even though I worked for them and I was friendly with them. And they were the people who dreamt that up. Ed Bass puts the money out for it, $150 million. I go on to my next job. So I was only there for 2 years. And then enter Bannon when the thing starts falling apart, which is where you picked it up. And yes, he was kind of a Goldman Sachs guy. But I think that actually Bass was the one who brought him in, I think, and took the thing over, and now it's owned by, I think, one of the universities in New Mexico or something. But you pick it up there because you actually know more about the Bannon aspect of that than I do.
You know, I gotta admit, this was something I brushed on relatively superficially compared to the level of depth that you're coming at from an insider's perspective. The entire project, you're way ahead of the curve than I am. All I know from what little I had looked into before I put my show together a couple of weeks ago was that the mandate. I found it interesting that from 1992 to 95, when Bannon was sort of directing the process, the mandate of the venture was transformed from being something which I find to be rather optimistic in terms of like exploring. Yes. I like the idea of terraforming and sustaining biospheres on other planets as far as like an optimistic long-term vision.
They were optimistic.
Yeah, I think that's rare. We're especially in a very nihilistic society. So I like that, but he transformed the mandate into more of a investigation of closed systems, ecosystems on the Earth, and eliminated a lot of that whole idea of human beings in the universe. And that, when I look at one of the key functions of the technocratic ideology of governance, it's premised around the idea that the Earth's ecosystems are closed systems. They're closed models, programmable within a computer model, and human beings are just parts of those closed ecosystems, ourselves being closed systems, which is what justifies the idea that we have to reduce our consumption, reduce our population, reduce all of those things in order to adapt to the natural systems that we evolved into, like other good, well-behaved species of cattle, dogs, and rabbits do. So, you know, for me, that was a big red alarm. It doesn't mean that somebody's bad, but I mean, looking at the whole spectrum of the programs that he was a part of coming out of Goldman Sachs to the present, it was a big red alarm, and a weird one at that. It
makes sense. And yes, he's problematic. And then on the other hand, like he does have some good messaging on some things, but I mean, what did Trump call him? Sloppy Sloppy Steve?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that, Trump had a more sophisticated appreciation for international diplomacy than a lot of people realized, even though he would speak with a bit of a, I mean, on the surface, you wouldn't get that when you just listen to his tweets or the things that he would sometimes say as sledgehammer words. But then he would go and do these brilliant diplomatic maneuvers, like meeting up all of a sudden with Kim Jong-un and just reducing decades of tension buildup out of, one brilliant meeting and brokering meetings with South and North Korean leaders and other, there was, again, a very impressive sophistication that Bannon was running roughshod over. And yes. I think when you look at the mandate that Bannon put forth, especially with things like the Unite the Right movement that the Dignité Humanae Institute, which is this weird Habsburg-run think tank, run out of an 800-year-old monastery in Italy. It's a very creepy organization which professes to try to essentially carry forth Otto von Habsburg's life's mission. And I mean, this is a guy who led the pan-European movement, which was devoted to creating a system of benign feudalism around one interpretation of a very radicalized Christianity. But it's a Christianity, it's a definition of Christianity that's set in complete opposition to the Muslim world, to the Buddhist world, to the Confucian world. So it's kind of like a repackaging of the Huntington Clash of Civilizations doctrine, but with that would be more acceptable to a anti-neocon conservative audience who would normally reject. They're kind of disgusted by what we've done to Iraq and to a lot of the world by this neocon logic. So a lot of people are moving away from that. They're moving away from Lynn Cheney and other things. But now they're falling into this other net that's there to catch them, which Bannon seems to be pushing.
I'm speaking with Matthew Ehret. We're going to take our very first break of this hour. This is TNT Deprogram. We'll be right back.